Right, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, both online and in person. Tonight, we are very privileged to have Professor Mike with us, who has a pedigree that you would not believe. Cambridge, Harvard, government initiatives, and tonight he's going to tell us how big business can help with climate change. Thank you, Mike.
So I began my industrial career as in a manufacturing engineering setting. And the one thing you know in an industrial setting, it never raises expectations. You always have people have low expectations and then deliver above them. It's a profoundly important part of career enhancement. So thank you for the welcome, and hello to everyone remotely, and thank you to those of you in the room. Light for just small group. I apologise. I will do my very best to keep to about 45 minutes discussing what is really a nice topic. I mean, it is the most profound topic perhaps we face today, but it is a vast topic nonetheless. Because when we take a title like and of course I put all my annotated heading slides just where the Zoom bar is going to be to confuse you, but if you took this title, can big business really help with the climate crisis? If one of my PhD students brought me that, I would send them back and say, let's define a little more precisely now, please. Not least what we mean by this word big, as a kind of pivotal question. And then questions around what the climate crisis really is and the consequences of the relationship between business and I'll try and unpack some of that. And again, we have a relatively short period of time. And I want to try and be reasonably provocative and also reasonably optimistic. And that's not because I think we have a hope in hell of achieving a 1.5 degrees C restriction in our global climate. I think that is long past. But every fraction of a degree we can avoid is better for the planet. And so the idea that we shouldn't be seeking urgent, critical changes to our industrial systems and try and obviate the worst of climate change. It seems to me to be a no-brainer. But it is still a field which is, it's very easy to become doom-laden. It's very easy to become doom-laden, especially when we unpack some of the systemic dynamics that reinforce some of our problem areas. And part of the challenge is we have monsters with charlatans shouting in the midst of all this, who are going to make a lot of money from their claims to offer you. I noticed people starting to talk about silver bullets, the magic bullet is a phrase, of course, unique single solutions that will solve everything. And the real insight I hope and bring this evening is that when you're thinking about adjusting a system, no one thing is ever going to be a fix. And that when you make interventions into complex systems, you will have unintended consequences. Some things that will make it worse than you anticipated. Some things that will make it unexpectedly better than you anticipated. So I'm trying to unpack a little bit of that as well. Yeah, and I am Michael Lewis, and I'm a professor at the University of Bath. Hopefully we'll be reasonably interested in the next 45 minutes or so. Electric vehicles will not save the planet. That I am certain. But battery technology might go a long way towards it. Now, electric vehicles are a precursor towards the acceleration, dramatic acceleration of battery technology, and potentially they're part of the solution. You see, this is what I start to say. When you think about simple solutions, if they're nested in more complex systemic solutions, potentially they have value. But Tesla, well, maybe more on them later. And then, of course, we picked the perfect day. I assume that's why you scheduled something for this week. It is the Conference of the Parties number 27, sponsored by Coca-Cola's. Who like a bit of sponsorship on things. And in a way, that sort of unpacks a lot of the moments that people often feel in this conversation, the role of business in climate crisis. Because business is often portrayed as the bad. It is the baddie in the room, and others' job is to kind of marshal and constrain business because it's business that brings the climate. But of course, it's never as easy as that. But business is the economy, is our wealth, is our ability to think, everything else that makes our life worth living. So it's a non-simple distinction between business and others. But it is still somewhat ironic, I think, that COP27 in a state that is, well, let's say at least challenging in terms of some of the criteria we associate with democracy and free speech, and sponsored by Coca-Cola. And then when you see the flight pattern from earlier this morning of all of the jets flying into Sharm el-Sheikh, many of them small occupancy, high carbon burn, private jets bringing high net worth individuals with carbon footprints individually that would replicate entire villages and towns in some parts of Sub-Saharan. You can see it's primed for parody. And of course, the other side of parody comes up misery and depression and let's give up, it's too much to be done. But there is a reason to meet, there is a reason for governments to get together, because again, the idea that business is separate from the government entities in which it sits is mad. The regulatory environment in which an organisation sits is critical to its ability or otherwise to even articulate a problem around climate change. I was on, I don't think, sorry, I would apologise if anyone from Heart FM is on the listening today. I was doing an interview in Heart FM today about Bristol Airport. Now, this may be, of course, close to some of your hearts, but you probably know, somewhat tangled story, that Bristol Airport wants to expand. Bristol Airport weirdly is owned by the Ontario Teachers Fund pension scheme, which is a slightly weird, but by a different investment fund, looking to maximise its return. And they want to expand Bristol Airport because there's potential relative amount of flying and stuff works that's not yet served. And so the business model there, and they want to expand the airport, but the local authorities didn't want to grant them permission for that. If you've been to Bristol Airport, you probably know why. Any place is an odd place to have an airport in many ways. The story is it was set up to be an airport to test pilots in really difficult windy conditions. So you know, a curious place to put a major airport for those people who don't want to be tested in there. But the conversation goes simply, we don't want it, it's not a dirty wrong place, and it busts our carbon budget here, locally, in this boundary. But of course, the appeal against that restricted permission went to Department of Health, was it? Housing, leveling up, whatever it's called, like the Burning Department has, was, now it's again. And their planning team said, no, you should allow this, on the ground that we can't include the climate impacts because that's a national and international concern, and so we can't account for it at the local level. It's almost like an accounting error, accounting problem. If I can't account for it here because it has to be the national, and we haven't broken the national climate budget on our net zero emissions, and so it's not a problem. I can't refuse permission on that basis. Now, the wonderful BAAN, Bristol Airport Action Network, have raised an enormous amount of money and barristers. We've got the right to appeal. It's happening today and tomorrow in Bristol. Self victory will be happening in Bristol rather than London. And their argument is we have to take climate part of it because it's planes with contrails. We're talking about 80,000 extra flights and 220 million extra passenger journeys. And we can't be caught up in this kind of accounting dilemma. Whose budget when? We have to bust the 1.5 degree term here, yeah, because it's going to come. And so that's one of our great challenges. And of course, that's all about governance and governments and the rules we set and the clarity we offer business over time to know if they can or can't invest. So to distinguish between business and the regulated environment that finds itself in is meaningless. You have to recognise those two are part and parcel of the same thing. And that's what this must be about in large part, and also financial disbursement for compensation for those countries who will suffer the most under climate change, while those countries who will cause most of it. And the irony, of course, really for Britain is, whilst the climate crisis might be bad, one of the consequences we're likely to get a recent climate in the southeast. And this kind of idea of the challenge to the global norm. Canada might be a really attractive place to live. It's already from Britain, of course, but a large part of it is rather frozen and unpleasant will become very attractive. It's not terrible for Canada. It's not really terrible for Britain. But go to Sub-Saharan Africa, we're already talking about 15 degree plus temperatures, and then again, you see the connections migration, or the other things that we're currently trying to debate in our politics, and see how these things start to be connected systemically. So can big business be part of the answer? Well, I declare a slight mea culpa here. I'm not sharing or saying how I'm not pronounce your Latin, first do no harm. And this has come to me, I guess, like many, recently later in my life, with the understanding of carbon and its impact on the climate. I started my career as a steel coking steel, high energy fuel, the joy of a cloud. You mean is a speck in the sky. Steel dry cross control, but now I lose a little frisson to me. And then cars and aerospace and other things in that early phase of my industrial and research career. So I kind of have my own debt into this, I have my own skin in this game, and it's not a good one. That's 1969 when I was born, 53 years old, for those who want some quick maths, and that's our atmospheric 500,000 carbon now. Some people say there's not a very big difference in 500,000. So the lovely it's one of the people that had a campaign about a few weeks ago where they talked about if you want to understand the difference that small part per million carbon makes in the atmosphere, think about the difference between a decaf and a strong decaf. Minuscule effect and the agitating it on the system. And then over time, I've become very, very involved in regulation, law, and large major projects, and pouring concrete. Again, through a lot of that, I talked a lot in my career about doing things on time, efficiently, effectively, but perhaps not enough about the environmental cost of the work. So my carbon life is not a great one. I'm trying to rectify that a little bit now, but many of us are the same. And so it's very mindful when I have students to engage with when I try and get them to understand the challenge for an industrial system as it starts to understand how to respond to climate change. And in some ways, how difficult it is to think about the idea of never throwing anything away. Right? So many of our students are doing quite compact and BG flats, right? If they're not being clean and empty when they arrive and their parents drop them off, and then especially in May, with hours, they look like a bomber's hit, and then slowly they fill. We pathologise this behaviour, of course. We have television programs with hoarders, and we help them to clean their houses. We have people who tell us that this always was hopeless, in a sense. They're right, clutter and disease and mess and rats and all the rest of it is bad. But when we throw away, we don't get rid of, we simply move the boundary of our system. We simply take it to landfill or to incineration or to recycling, maybe, although a lot of recycling is problematic, it's kind of configured as well. So the idea of thinking about industrial systems change is about, in part, thinking about stuff that's beyond your boundary, shifting the boundary outwards. And when you do that, you start to think about all sorts of accountabilities. If you had to be accountable for the stuff you threw away, what would you do? What would you do if instead of being a good person putting it in the green bin in the brown bin, you were accountable for the stuff that's in that as it possessed its way for the future? Somebody would send you an update on your phone and tell you where it was in the process, and then charge you depending on the route it took through the system. That's the kind of challenge we're putting to industrial systems, but not just in terms of.
Excuse me, could you come a bit closer to hear the people online if I would?
To
hear.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Thank you. This right. Sorry. I thought it's been very stationary today. To give you a sense of the ants. My mother always says I have ants in my pants. What was I saying? Oh, so yeah. This is not just downstream, which is kind of what we're describing there. It's also upstream. It's also, where has this stuff come from? Not only now are you accountable for the stuff you bought and then took care of in disposal. I'm asking you to be accountable for how it was made, where it came from, in which factories, at what point in time, using what kind of energy. And I want you to have that on your lap on the phone, so you can be audited at any point in time. And that's you as an individual. Just think for a second about you give up your life to do that. That will become your life. Now, some of us can solve that by shortening some of these circuits. We can compost in our own gardens. We can use less stuff. And you start to see the shape of some of the big systemic conclusions and implications, even as you start to extend that thought experiment. But that challenge, the scope of the challenge, we talk in industrial systems about scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. The carbon that's a consequence of the direct productive activity and direct energy use of industrial systems, and then the stuff that comes in its supply chain and in its selling chain, forward and back. And for most organisations in the Northern Hemisphere, in particular, most UK firms, UK big business, it is scope 3 that's the biggest challenge. Because that's the stuff that we put elsewhere. That's what we've done. We've been not the hoarders. We've pushed it to China. We've pushed it to Vietnam. We've pushed it to places around the globe. And so that idea of distance and boundary, we have to get our heads around that and how what that means in terms of the complexity of managing some of these industrial systems in a more sustainable way. And you can see that when you start looking at some of the data about global value chains and their greenhouse gas emissions. Now, I'm focusing here on carbon dioxide and carbon dioxide equivalents as the kind of major dependent variable of our systems. But of course, there are a whole range of other pollutants that we have to be considering. I read today, numbers verified, but it seemed plausible because I know the number of tyres that are made every year, that almost 1 billion tyres every year disappear. So it's not that we burn them or recycle them or store them, we just don't know where they are. And I presume it means they're, in a street down the bottom here somewhere, or in someone's back garden, or they've done, maybe you turned it into a plant product. They used to do that in the 70s, but we still do. But that's just disappeared. That's this kind of pollutant into the environment. Like carbon, a consequence of poor diesel engine tuning, a whole host of other pollutants as well. So we are predominantly focused here on megatons of carbon dioxide, but it is not the only crisis factor we should be thinking about. But when we think about the idea of where the carbon is, it's in these global value chains, and largely that means that no matter the fact that we are located here, much of the carbon footprint of those products is coming from another part of the world here. If you take the top 8 broadly defined value chains, i.e., I buy something and it connects across a whole series of economic actors, then those top 8, food, construction, fashion, fast-moving consumer goods, electronics, automotive, professional services, interestingly enough, something that we have a strength on in the United Kingdom, supply systems, logistics systems account for almost half of our global greenhouse emissions. So the first question was, can big business really help climate change, address the climate crisis? Well, maybe it can, maybe it can't, but the first sub-answer must be, it has to. It is integral to the problem itself. And so, it must is the answer. As part of a slightly different question, which you always do if you're a good student, trying to find a way to answer your supervisor's questions. No. It's not working. It's sort of frozen. I'll do a manual only. And let's just start to give a little bit more specificity to that conversation there. And in some senses, this is, I think I said before, it's very easy to fall into a kind of doom-laden, I nearly said doomster, but that would remind you too much of the outgoing Prime Minister, but one. Yeah, but one, amazing. In the news again today. what was I saying? Then let's start to be a little bit more contingent. Again, let's answer that exam question slightly more precise way. And I think in some senses this does make us a little bit more miserable. You can't quite read this in this projector, I'm afraid. But what we have here is some work done by Goldman Sachs. Now, interestingly, Goldman Sachs, investment banks, investment funds, you might think of them almost as the uber bad people in all of this, right? But interestingly, those people who own generic funds, large-scale generic funds, are organized actually as investors really, really interested in climate crisis because they are exposed across a wide panoply of risks. If you think about their portfolio investments, it means they can't be hidden. They can't engage in pollution haven behavior because they are invested all throughout. So they are being hit and bit by these changes, regardless of maybe some of their investments in some of the primary causal factors. And anyway, once again, it's a total system. So if you start isolating the bad person against the good person, what does that mean? What really does that mean? So, so if you're interested in this stuff, I don't normally say we go to an investment bank website, but they have a website which is called Carbon. They have a number of really interesting and well thought through reports. They take the economist's view, which is very detached and lacks the kind of empathy with the fact that people are actually dying with some of these changes they're talking about. But it is some of the best analysis you will read independent of government, I think. And one of their analyses is to look at the different kinds of organisation and their carbon footprints in terms of scope 3 and scope 1 and 2 intensity. So some industries are very energy intensive in what they do. A steel plant would be the classic case in point of that. You use a lot of energy to heat a lot of things, to process a lot of things, and use a lot of hydrocarbons as well as part of the core process as well. So it's not just energy as an intensive source of energy, it's also a core part of the process. And so scope 1, scope 2 emissions are very intense in those kind of industries. Them up here, no, can't really see here, sorry at all. Chemicals, you might be able to just about read here, the kind of similar equivalent organisation to a steel plant in many ways. Energy intensity value used hydrocarbons as an input part of the process. So high scope 1 and 2. And some of those organisations we talk about in big business, we talk about the idea of them being hard to abate, so difficult to decarbonise, are actually those kind of organisations with quite intense scope 1 and scope 2. So they're localised. And that's quite interesting, actually, because although technologically we might not be ready to deploy immediately solutions into, say, making steel in a more environmentally friendly way, the fact they are scope 1 and scope 2 does make them, from a systems perspective, a little bit easier to solve, actually, because they tend to be localized in their problem space. Some of the businesses that look like they're lower carbon, but have a huge scope 3 carbon footprint, if you think about that, it's that kind of diverse. It's like, can I sort out I insulate my own house? It's much harder to make sure the council changes its recycling policy. So there's a kind of interesting differential around scope 1 and scope 2 in terms of the agency, the managerial interventions, the organising interventions that we make. Then there are those organisations, mining and metals, oil refiners, oil and gas producers, that are both high scope in 3 emissions. These are regulated for revenue, by the way, just to give you a sense of the scaling, and high in their scope 1 and 2. So these are the most intense and challenging organisations to consider in terms of their carbon abatement. There's a whole cluster of businesses here. Really can't read them. There's things like healthcare services, telecom services, aerospace, not airlines, aerospace. You can be quite low carbon making an aeroplane. It's just the flying which is your problem. They're not really worrisome as far as Goldman Sachs concerns or we should be concerned, because their relative carbon footprint means that under the current trajectories, their current efforts probably will do a reasonable amount of recovery for us. There's a contingent question we have to answer always. There's still, sorry, I just spotted it up here, scope 1 and scope 2. There's this high challenge around hard to abate industries versus those where really, yes, they have a challenge in terms of their carbon footprints, but it is probably manageable, and manageable as well within technological envelopes that currently exist today. That's not to say you can't use current technologies to reduce and decarbonise significant amounts of, in particular, energy use in those hydrocarbon-rich businesses. But still, these are harder to do than these. And so when you start in your mind thinking about big business, what I'm just saying is start to overlay a little bit of contingency. The people who look like they're amazing, maybe they start in a place that's very, very, very different. And I'm not going to be disrespectful of B Corps, because I think anything that encourages transparency and sharing of what you're doing is critical to this process. But most B Corps are sort of born quite virtuous, in a place which is quite virtuous, doing a product, serving a community who quite value the work they do. And so it's not that it's easy what they do, but they start in an easier place. That's easier than going to Kazakhstan and taking ArcelorMittal's integrated coal mine and steel plant and saying to them, let's talk about electrification. So there's a kind of interesting set of different starting points, different contingencies we have to think about as we start to unpack here. Yes, is unreasonably miserable? Yes, because a lot of this is very hard. And there's another reason to be miserable as well, of course, which is that we seek to reduce our carbon emissions. When we talk about net zero, let's remind ourselves we don't really mean net zero, we mean reducing back to 1990 levels. Again, just be careful with language, be careful with the easy assumptions in this space. But we know that we are still burning and pulling and extracting more oil. And we know that, in particular, the kind of core logistics tissue, which is sort of one of my specialist areas, is really, really still hugely reliant on hydrocarbons. And so there's lots of really, that's the connective tissue of the global economy. And so there's a kind of profound challenge there as well. At the moment, things are still getting worse. For all of the graphs you may see with things tipping, we're still drawing more hydrocarbons out of the system. There are also other things that come with this as well. I just throw this in here because there's a really interesting question in my mind about, again, reason why you need conferences. We have electrification proceeding reasonably effectively in some industry segments in the Northern Hemisphere. What's happening to a lot of the product and service that we would have traditionally used here, internal combustion engines, for instance, is they're migrating themselves to the global south. So a lot of the lorries that you would never see in Bath anymore are still on the road, they're just on the road somewhere else. And so there's a kind of interesting question about the full life of products and services we have to think about as well. In fact, that question of time is, in some sense, the hardest dynamic for any intervention, any systemic thinking about improving industrial processes. We'll see in a minute when we talk about offsetting and planting trees. And what's a really good example of it? Anyone got an ID3? No? It's not about the car, right? It's unlike a Tesla, it's built from the ground up, using a lot of carbon. It's not a light vehicle, unlike a Tesla, it's sort of a heavy vehicle. You buy it, you can't get hold of them, right? I mean, Volkswagen have got 250,000 vehicles currently globally sat in as work in process because they can't get the microprocessors that need to go in the car to make it work. But support that by. They did some really interesting example, give us a really interesting example of the electric vehicle here. On Volkswagen, in some senses, again, it's a great example of this is not an organisation that is a business independent of government. The German government have significantly funded the German car industry's transition away from internal combustion engines to battery. Billions of pounds of a scale that we couldn't even conceive of in this country as an industrial strategy intervention, just completely out of kilter. But so there's no business in the classic sense of just a decision here. They have been pushed to move towards these significant climate commitments. And of course, the Germans have a problem. They make a lot of cars. And cars fall into one of those hard to abate scope 1, 2, and 3 categories. What they note on their website, and those of you who know a bit about things like the life cycle analysis might be aware of this, of course, the thing about carbon is it's not just now. You don't just account for it today. You have to account for it, especially if it's a product that exists in time, over time. It's the use of the thing that very often generates most of the carbon footprint. And because of that, you have to make assumptions again about how long a product will be used and how it will be used. And then you're starting to see where some of the challenges come even with measuring this stuff. How do you know whether people are going to drive a vehicle fast or slow? How do you know what kind of roads they're going to be on? How do you know what kind of driving they're? You don't, so you develop averages and models that are based on averages, and rather like the OBR forecast for our national debt, they can vary in a huge scope and span. And so, consequently, this is all based on assumptions, but there's a really interesting analysis, which you would have heard before, I'm sure, which is that basically internal combustion engine vehicles, despite them being combustion engines, actually have lower carbon footprints for a large part of their life cycle than electric vehicles, largely because of the reduction in the battery technology and the extractions you need to do to get the raw materials from the battery. So Volkswagen themselves make this point here that gasoline car, tons of CO2 equivalent, that's what the E means, for an ID3 is almost double during the production phase of the Golf, which is there. You have to drive that vehicle for something like, does it say here? I don't know if it's got it on here. Yeah, something like 200,000 kilometers before you have a lower carbon footprint in your ID3 you do in the ICE equivalent of the Golf. And that's actually terrible, right? At one level, if you scrap the car at 80,000 kilometers, most vehicles do, even if you don't own them for all that time, they do have a life that takes them into those kind of time frames. So it is in aggregate probably a good thing still. But it's not easy. It's not simple calculation to understand the trade-offs and the complexity models that are involved in these decisions. This is one of the reasons why electric vehicles will not save the planet. So let me try and frame it for you in a slightly clearer systems logic. And when things about system, a whole host of definitions one might use, but I tend to resolve it to its real basics. It's a decision you make around a boundary. Every system is bounded. You have to, there are natural boundaries, like the planetary boundary, which is some of the conversation we're having now about climate, but that's a really wide boundary, right? So most of us have to live within narrower boundaries, and businesses, for regulatory, customer, supplier, employee reasons, generally have narrower boundaries on them. So they draw a boundary, and within that boundaries, activities connect together, they link together, and critically, they loop into one another as well. Now, we've lived through a pandemic, right? So most of us now have a sort of, I hope, intuitive understanding of exponential growth. The fact that things can feed on themselves, and consequently, rather than getting linear growth patterns, you get these exponential growth patterns. And that's terrible when it's a disease. It's terrible when it's carbon emissions, when you have fires in a permafrost environment, such that that accelerates the melting of permafrost, which encourages more fires, which means you get acceleration, and you have a very similar effect to a pandemic-type protocol. It can be your absolute enemy, and rushing to get ahead of that, as we know from our experience through the COVID pandemic, is really, really hard. It's really, really hard. So these systems have dynamics that look like they have life of their own. And they're at the heart of our understanding of climate science, and that's why climate science is kind of challenging to understand actually intuitively, because some of the net effects are related to complex systems interactions, not just to linear interaction effects. But our industrial systems have these as well. And so when one makes an intervention into industrial systems, so again, remember my hypothesis is industry must, business must address the climate change, because at least 50 to 60%, even if just that top half of our value chains of greenhouse gas emissions, we do make interventions. And we have to be careful that we don't make things worse. You have to make sure that you are not making things worse.
And, one of the real risks, I think, with electric vehicles, we've seen actually, it's empirical evidence, it's what they call the rebound effect, that people drive more with their electric vehicle because they're feeling virtuous. They want to go and show everyone I have an electric vehicle. I'll drive, don't worry, I've got an electric vehicle. These kind of conversations, they're just different. And I own an electric bike, not an electric vehicle, but I can imagine that. I can imagine just feeling slightly more virtuous when I drive, in a way that I feel slightly guilty when I get our diesel, which I've got. So there's something like that rebound effect. You give people the opportunity to do things in a lower carbon way, and then they do more of it. I certainly think that will happen if we can reduce the carbon in flying. I think you could quite easily see an environment where say, oh, it's okay to fly, and people want to fly, right? You can see that. But this is a more important one, which is tree planting. There is no meaningful pathway to 1.5 or 2 degrees up in our growth that doesn't involve significant carbon capture. Right? Now, some of that is still carbon capture, which people use the kind of magic machines. You'll see them, they're like big boxes and they're magic. And stuff comes in one end and carbon is captured. There's a huge amount of unproven waffle and fraud in the carbon capture markets. There are places where you can do it, and there are options for storing, but they tend to be geographically constrained, and they tend to be constrained around processes. And they'll often require precursor processes before you can do effective carbon capture. For instance, if you burn carbon as a fuel in clinker and you create a flume, you end up with a mixed evacuation, so CO2 and other things in it, and then you've got to clean that up before you can store the carbon. It becomes a more complex mess than if you just did electricity and had clean carbon coming out of the chimney. But tree planting is something we use today. You go flying again, you will be offered the chance to offset your flight. Right? They will ask you, do you want to pay, I don't know what it is, £2, £8, £12 to offset your flight, your X tons of flight, wherever you fly. And that will largely be some kind of planting scheme. Not always, there's other environmental sustainability in farming and other things as well, but largely there's a hell of a lot of tree planting going on. And that's sensible because we know that trees from photosynthesis take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, and so consequently can reduce the carbon content of the atmosphere. Except that, again, like our vehicles, that costs carbon to put them in the ground. If you plant them too tightly, they don't live very long. If you plant them in the wrong place, they change the soil salinity. That creates wash-off that can ruin other parts of your agricultural or natural environments. There's a lot of evidence from some of the Scottish attempts to do some offset planting recently that leaving land alone was better carbon capture than actually putting trees in it in the first place. And then, even if you design all of that correctly, like my electric vehicle, you've probably got to keep it in the ground between 90 and 150 years. Now, many of them will die, and so they have to be replaced or filtered in. If they die and fall and burn, and the whole thing catches fire because you've got climate heating around it at the same time, then all of that carbon sink, which you all felt very virtuous about, right, to tick your box, is gone. You might all be dead when that happens, but it still doesn't matter. The carbon we've all been saved in this complex system has gone back up to the atmosphere. And so these systems, these interventions, these offsets are just non-trivial. They're non-trivial. This is a profoundly important. Nature-based solutions are profoundly central to all our attempts to offset some of the hard-to-abate carbon while we get there, while we electrify everything. But it's not straightforward. It's not a simple solution. Again, there's no magic bullet. I can't remember why I put that in there. I think probably because I was thinking this is a BRS, LS, whatever. And to make myself seem more erudite. This is a rather wonderful picture. I just want to tell you about it's really important. The point I'm making about systems and systems boundaries. You may have seen this in National Gallery. It's one of these kind of legendary. There's a connection, of course, because as you probably know, protesters are throwing paint at magnificent pieces of work in an attempt to claim attention to the climate crisis. So there maybe there's a sort of connection here. This piece almost certainly commissioned for wealthy clients, bears enormous study and consideration. It reflects a whole host of different themes. But famously, John Berger, who you may remember from the 70s and 80s, with a famous television art critic, the very first television art critics, absolute hero of mine, wonderful guy. He picks up on a very common theme in art criticism of this picture, which is that if you think about it in total, I think it's fairly obvious what Venus and Mars have been up to. If you don't understand, you can ask me afterwards. But there's a very long shaft here, and he's asleep. That's all I'll say. But there's a kind of interesting conversation in art. There's lots. He's so asleep, right? He's blowing a conch in his shell, and he can't wake up. He's been to battle, and there's all the rest of it. But Venus, if you crop her face closely and tightly, it seems like this kind of pure, it's a study of purity, when actually the whole picture is one of earthly shame and the reality of humanity, conflict and love and all this stuff. So if you don't want to embrace the idea of genuine climate crisis and business engaging and resolving that, I guess my point is it might look a bit messy and dirty. And there's no real benefit in us leaping in and saying, oh, this is the kind of purity. I can't see any pathway that meaningfully reduces carbon in our industrial systems that doesn't look a bit messy and compromised at various times through that process. We have to deal with oil and gas and their transition. And I find that very difficult when they're generating profits of the kind they are now. It's my instinctive reaction, I guess, like many of you in the room, would be to say, what? But they are a fundamental part of the industrial economy, and if we don't find a way of making that transition happen, then we will have no transition at all. So let me offer some solace in the last 5 or 6 minutes. It's okay. I think there are 3 things, and this is sort of I use these as my gauge of whether an organisation is serious or not, a business is serious or not about making its commitments. Most of the FTSE have committed, for investment reasons and other reasons, to significant most of the FTSE have carbon reduction that looks realistic. If you look at their carbon plans, they have reduced carbon. Their plans for 2030 are to push off their historical trajectory and do even more. So if you hold them to their words, then we should be okay. But in that would be all the usual, can I say bullshit, and greenwashing. So one has to have a way of digging in and saying, are they serious about this? And at one level you have to think, yes, of course they're serious about this, because the people who work in these organisations are us. They're middle-aged men and women in senior leadership positions who are themselves thinking about the legacy they will leave at last. There'll be sociopaths and psychopaths there as well. I mean, 1 or 2 of them. But certainly most people. Well, I had an MBA reunion a few weeks ago up on our brand new, very carbon-intensive, new building. And, they were all sort of my age and a little bit older, some of them. And just engage with this topic, and many of them have changed their careers in order to be able to engage with this topic. I'm involved with an venture fund at the moment called Zinc, and the number of entrepreneurs whose entire focus is to do things that say, look, what I really want to do is, okay if we make money, but I want to remove carbon. So I've seen it kind of cause for optimism, but we have to have a guide that says, what are these people really doing? Because then that comes to my final point, which is about what our responsibilities in the face of the businesses. First of all, it's about accountability, right? So government plays an critical role here, and that's why we have problematic governance in the UK, because of its variability at the moment. It's almost less important what it is than it is consistent, so that people can build the platforms around it to drive forward meaningful costs of carbon and drive that forward accordingly. So there are hundreds of them. But the one that holds me with the most enthusiasm at the moment, and if you are not aware of it, then I would encourage you to research it, are the science-based targets. Now, this is an attempt to finally, I think, ask organisations to commit publicly to externally audited measures of their environmental performance and report on it in a fully transparent way. So you have to be a certain kind of organisation to be able to do that for all the complexity we just talked about in measurement. But you also have to be a certain kind of organisation in that you don't just want to be accountable to your regulator, you make accountability to yourself. Now, if this were a leadership seminar, I would say that's what good leaders do anyway, right? They take on accountability. They don't try and duck it and pass the buck. They want to own that responsibility. With owning that responsibility will come occasionally punishment and blame. You didn't achieve it. But I think those organisations that are committing to science-based targets are in the vanguard and are inducing the accountability and transparency that will potentially say, yes, they will drive forward and achieve those climate goals. I mean, again, just to reiterate, nearly every organisation in that space is making a commitment towards 1.5 to 2 degree pathways, but it's whether they achieve it or not, and accountability is critical to that. The other thing you might look for, again, it's back to my point about where does your rubbish go and where did your products come from, is the extent to which they're engaging in meaningful collaboration with their wider what we would say in business called ecosystem. How engaged with their customers and their customers' customers are they? Are they talking to you? Are they talking to trying to find out how you're doing things? Are they talking to their suppliers? Are they working with their suppliers? Now, there are some really interesting organizations out there. I'm a huge fan of some of the work that Schneider Electric are doing in this space. They have a completely aligned business model here, of course, because their controls business is clearly going to do great business if everyone electrifies everything. They have the product to help you on that pathway. I don't care about that. I don't care if they get fancy wealthy if on the way they electrify hard-to-obey industrial systems. But there are also some interesting ones. I mean, these are usual suspects. Patagonia, essentially still disposable product, and I don't think a lot of the product people buy from them you don't really need, but they do commit significantly to repair, and of course the owner has just given over his entire family ownership in the business to a trust to actively support climate initiatives, so you've got to give kudos to that. The company that interests me at the moment is Walmart. Now, Walmart found many other social SDG goals. I don't think I want to work for them, and certainly they don't like giving their employees certain certainly in North America, certain things we would consider to be fundamental rights. But their project Gigaton, given they're an organisation already in that sweet spot of reasonably easy to abate carbon footprints, but still it's mostly scope 3, and consequently the stuff they are doing to pull a gigaton of carbon out of their supply chain involves things like paying suppliers more if they commit to SDG rights. Right? So don't just say, do it, please, because we tell you, but in creating a financial incentive to do that as well. They're also, because it's quite hard to get access to some of these power purchasing arrangements using solar and wind if you're a small organisation, they're opening up their own purchasing arrangements with their solar in their solar entities and offering them to their suppliers, again, as an incentive to commit to their joint carbon reduction plans. So again, they're using their collaborative endeavour, their market, in a collaborative way. And so just as a signal, if you're looking and thinking, is this organisation, is this big business serious about the way it's going to engage with its climate responsibilities? How is it engaging with its supply chain? And that's non-trivial. It's non-trivial. H&M even. Now, one has to be careful because fast fashion, a huge amount of that product is another mea culpa. I spent many years stalling the virtues of Zara and their fast fashion model as an extraordinary cash-generating business. But so if you've seen the pictures of the Atacama Desert with the hundreds of tons of clothes that have never been worn and just dumped there to live effectively forever in the cold, arid desert of that place, then fast fashion is not great. But H&M, with their bond issuance recently, raising money to fund some of their decarbonisation, have created incentive structures where if they meet their carbon targets, they get reduced interest payments, and if they fail to meet them, they pay more on the bonds. They're consequently creating a kind of incentive structure with their funders massively oversubscribed, right? Because you can see the pump. There's a threshold, and then there's an upside to it as well. So there's good examples of decent practice. And if we had more time, we could talk about there's hundreds of these that do give you cause for optimism. The general principle for me is: are they really in a collaborative frame? Because they cannot do it on their own. And then the final thing, and this is where I'll sort of draw to a close, and invite questions, hopefully be some. Technology is a reason to be cautiously optimistic. Now, technology has caused many of these problems. So you might argue it's the intensification of industry through hydrocarbons as what's accelerated our kind of human impact on the planet to planetary scale. But when you look at the cost curves and the performance curves of the fundamental step to all of this, you'll know this, I'm sure, everyone is slightly aware of what's going on, is electrifying our power systems. And electrification of power, and then consequently electrification of core industrial processes, is enormously helped by a cost curve on photovoltaics that is a collapsing cost, whereby essentially almost every quarter there's more product, and the product is cheaper and higher. And batteries, while they've had a bit of a gap in the last year because of some of the supply chain issues, are not on dissimilar pathways. And now that must give us some cause for optimism, because it starts to open up the possibility of genuinely reducing the carbon intensity of that scope 1, scope 2 space. And there are problems if you want to talk about, how do you create heat and how do you do direct heating and all the rest of it in industrial systems. We can do that, but that must be a cause for optimism. And again, it's a systemic response to the German government effectively giving loads of money to the Chinese suppliers to get to scale. Now, the geopolitics of China being central in all this technology is another talk another day. And I'm not naive about the geopolitics of this. But it shows you what can happen when a market economy works and drives mass production in a way that is supportive of climate goals. There are challenges, of course, though, as well. And the cost of technologies that will allow us to reduce carbon, this is again from the carbonomic space, in the areas like heavy-duty vehicles and aviation, we're a long way in from technologies to do that. Even with Elon's electric trucks apparently on the way. So technology is a reason, I think, to be a little bit more optimistic. I'll leave you with this, but somebody I know in a steel plant just rang me this morning, and they were talking about the input cost of their iron ore, and it spiked up and it spiked down as kind of volatility. And the volatility always in these commodity markets, so you mustn't read too much into it. But this is over a 10-year plus time frame. And what you have really is the sort of, at very worst, flatlining of the iron ore markets, suggesting that the world is coming to the realization that we've known theoretically for about 20 years we don't need any more steel. That we can start to just reuse the steel we already have. But that market is more or less at best in decline. Whereas electrify everything is driving copper markets to grow and expand. Now, as a supply chain specialist, there are huge issues with copper, where it's going to come from and how much we'll need, and the mines you'll have to dig to make that happen, lithium and other rare earth metals the same. But as indication, back to my original question, can big business help address the climate crisis? And guess my observation is, it needs to do more. And that doing more is evident in some of the organizations we see as leading firms. And the final point, that can only happen because big business is only just part of the system here. If you have government regulation that drives appropriate prices of carbon and other regulation, so we have consistent investment. And then finally, that we as consumers, and I'm not a fan of that everyone's about consumers, but if we seek out those that are accountable clearly engaged in collaboration and investing in the right technologies and support those and punish the others, that's probably going to have a really big effect as well. Okay. I'll close it there. But I hope that was of some use. We say vast issue, and we covered it in 35, 40 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. To ask questions, and also the people online will want to ask questions, so maybe we'll alternate. We'll see how it goes.
I have notes here, and they're nothing like what I just put out.
Let me just switch the microphone on, and if you would point it.
Sorry for wandering around. Online.
So this is not a statement rather than a question. I think in a lot of cases we're going in the wrong direction.
Yep.
We've got some of the technologies already here, like, for example, railways. In the 60s, part of the beaching plan was to have 55 freight liner terminals all over the country, so that most of the long distance freight would go by rail and would be offloaded. This is where the sort of electric vehicles would come in for local delivery. Similarly, with electric, everyone seems to think electric cars are going to be the problem, but that doesn't solve the problem of PM 2.5s, which are coming off tyres and are causing major health problems, not only to our lungs, but to our rivers.
And yeah.
That's why we're going nuts with the hell.
No, I think that's something else, but it's a particularly developmental thing.
The tire is being washed into rivers, and this is some of the technology is already here, but of course very often the big business is lobbying in the direction they want to be going, and of course this happened with in the 60s we had a Ministry of Transport called Ernest Marbles, and he wanted to build motorways. So what did he do? None of this, we know we lost some of the railways, but of course they didn't do the major thing, which was freight liners. They started the freight liner terminal, but it all came to an end. And, we've really got to get back to things like much more public transport.
Oh, yeah.
Cycle tracks everywhere, so we can go by bike. But of course that means we've got to get rid of all these parked cars all over the place, which is what they're doing in Germany and on the continent, of course. And they have... they're putting in trams as well.
Well, you're on the manifesto, now in the statement, so it's good. No, I mean, look, there are two dimensions to my response, right? The first is I'd rather not talk about the UK specifically, because in a sense it doesn't really matter. Right? I mean, ultimately, and you're right, then those countries, I think, who are heading in the right direction are doing the things that you just talked about, have significantly. It can be no surprise to us that the French are essentially banning internal flights, but are correspondingly investing in an already established high-speed train network. And we could have dreamed really of that, couldn't we? I do a fair bit of stuff with the Scottish Government every now and again. The Scottish Government will not pay for flights as part of their carbon commitments, so they have to pay £250 train fares, and we need to go to Edinburgh rather than £10 from Bristol. I don't know if I'm going to be allowed into Bristol if I keep appearing on the radio talking about how terrible the company is. We want to expand them. I think you're obviously absolutely on the money. And I'll come back to the idea about technology. Yes, it's not all about high tech. And I hope I wasn't pushing the idea it's about high technology. Most of the technologies we need to do most of our decarbonisation we have now. Heat pumps are miraculous, but I've had a fridge a long time. I don't know about you. So the basic technology of an evaporating system, I've understood for a long time. So it's not that it's new. We can refine and develop and build them. To know that you should insulate your house. Now, again, I'll go back to the UK. There's a particularly profound question there. My biggest regret for the last 10 years in the UK is that we didn't invest in significant insulation. I think that's possibly the biggest policy mistake. Well, in a rich field of stupid decisions over the last decade, that may actually be in long term the most profound one. So yeah, when I say technology, I don't mean it has to be super advanced. I mean applying the ones we have. with a consistent purpose, and recognizing that what we're accounting as the cost now is nothing compared to the cost as we start to see having to move housing estates because they're underwater. So yeah, we're not going to disagree on that as well. Did I see a question on the screen?
Could you ask the people who are
in the chat
to unmute so that they can ask questions?
Oh no, they're just all moaning about the sound. I apologise.
Yeah, no, they haven't shouted. But can people online hear me? Please unmute if you want to ask a question. If not, we'll take another question in the room. Excuse me.
Thank you. Can I ask you about your view on gas? Because I gather there has been some suggestion at the carbon conference by people who are obviously in the gas industry that gas is perhaps greener, or is greener than everything else. And there's a very interesting article in the FT yesterday about Toby Rice, who's head of the biggest energy company we've never heard of, the DQT Energy in the States, which is apparently the biggest producer of gas. And he's in Pennsylvania, and he is arguing that the emissions from his gas fields, from the use of his gas, is half what it is for the go from West Virginia next door.
Well, yeah. So yeah, he's right. If you want to make your comparator, West Virginia coalfields, yeah, it's lovely. If you want to make your comparator, heating my house with a heat pump that's driven by my solar panel and a battery, it's just not even in the same ballpark. So it's a meaningful comparator. And I guess, to be fair, and my instinct to reaction is to say no, but in transitional terms, we need to embrace technologies that are relatively worse. The trouble is, we've reached a point now where it's such urgency. 10, 15 years ago, we might have argued for that. The bigger problem with gas for me is, in the UK in particular, is because we've invested in we have this amazing gas network, probably the best gas network in the world, actually, most resilient, widespread gas network. It's part of our life, flicking on the gas fire, cooking gas. It's part of the way we think about warmth and heat and all the rest of it. We don't think about the damp and all the rest of it starting to create. But it's so embedded, it's such a rigidity in our system that it's making other options feel like a bigger move than they might otherwise be. So a lot of conversation about blending hydrogen, for instance, in gas, which again is kind of madness, really. Just makes the gas less effective, and hydrogen production is itself problematic and will stress the pipes and creates explosive potential. There's a whole host of reasons why that's silly. But you can just sort of see that the fact we have such a good, robust system now, moving to another one feels like a really more challenging space. I haven't got it. I've got a picture here. It's perhaps a little lean. There's a company in Nigeria. It's not a company, it's a charity, it's a social enterprise called Cold Hubs. And what they do is they take old shipping containers and they stick an old refrigeration plant that they buy for essentially nothing off a trucking firm in the Golden North, and they put an old solar PV array. They again pick up for effectively nothing because it's the end of its reasonably effective life of power generation, and they stick the solar PV over the refrigeration unit and over this newly refrigerated shipping container, and they put them near markets in rural areas. So they're off-grid power refrigeration. They charge local farmers X% for a tray. So now a farmer, rather than do days travel without a car or to a market space, food waste would be 30-40% of their load. Now they can store it in a refrigerated unit, sell more, make more money, invest themselves in other technologies. So it's a good example, really. I think when you don't have any technology to start with, you move here to a more appropriate kind of technology. Itself lower footprint. But I'm not sort of away from your question, but I'm very nervous. The hydrocarbon firms have got very good at presenting themselves and inserting themselves in these conversations. I think not to their benefit. a lot of hydrogen debates, you only have to go 1 or 2 steps behind it and find a hydrocarbon firm promoting the idea. And I worry then about vested interest, not because you shouldn't have a vested interest, everyone has a vested interest, but as me as a voter, regulator, researcher, investigator, I want to find out what their incentive structure is to understand where they're driving their behaviour. But yeah, not fracking for sure. The methane, methane from fracking, across North America, and methane is 30 times more potent carbon equivalent. I mean, there's a whole host of challenging issues with fracking and gas in particular. A bit of a random answer.
Thank you very much. Any more questions in the room? Let's see if there's any questions online. I think
no,
not.
They're just moaning about just moaning about my movements and the microphone. I apologise.
But yeah, the difficulty you went through to get your presentation going at all were overcome, and I would say that's the big win. Thank you so much.
That's my absolute pleasure.
Marvellous talk today.
Oh no, I'm Keris. I think it's put their hand up. Do you want to go, Keris?
Yes. You goaded me into asking this question because I was one of the people who moaned about sound. You've talked about it very much from the technological point of view, but I just wanted to ask you whether you don't think there's a big public perception aspect of it. And just to sort of illustrate it with a very local example, which I appreciate is small on a global scale, but just to give you a sort of illustration, we have a local educational institution which has some, lots of behaviour change experts who are very good at telling the rest of us what to do. and you probably know what's coming. They have massive car parking there, which they conveniently treat as scope 3. And so, if you don't actually live or work on campus, it's quite easy to think, well, they can't really be taking it that seriously, so why should I? So, I mean, isn't there a huge public perception issue about if you've got big business who are really not taking it seriously, then doesn't that have a huge impact on how the public see it? And therefore, if you go through the electoral process, how our elected representatives see it as influenced by the public and so on? I mean, doesn't it have a sort of knock-on effect?
Yes, and I guess thank you, Karen, and I'm sorry about and I'm just Geraldine. So thank you for finding it informative, even though you missed some. I guess the recording of this you can watch it again if you want to do it. Again, I think I find the separation problematic because most of us work for these businesses or are customers of these businesses or work for businesses that work for these businesses, and that's kind of interesting. Always interesting conversation about where the boundary of that is. And it's certainly true still that many of us as individual consumers are making choices that make it harder for business. So I'm looking down the screen. And make it harder for business to do the things I think it might well want to do. There's very clear regulatory pressure in some of these areas. There's very clear investor pressure in some of these areas. For all the talk of activist investors undermining Unilever's efforts, there's a heck of a lot of good, strong institutional investors who are very keen to reduce their carbon footprint. They recognise the kind of meaningful. That's the long term. If you're in the agriculture business, you need to be worried about climate change, right? Because you're looking at found shifts to your supply chain. So yes, I guess. If your question is, do we need to make sure that people are aware of it? Yes. I mean, let me say, I can look at if I haven't got any food in me. I can look at a piece of food and it'll tell me whether it's got too much salt or too much sugar, and it'll tell me whether it's making me fat or how many calories, but it won't tell me what the carbon footprint is. It won't tell me whether it's a good or a bad use of carbon. So I'm left making judgments like, oh, these have come from Spain, so they must be not as good as ones that come from my local farm. Well, it may well be that a local farm is a more carbon-intensive process. It's been brought by, they've used fertilizer in a particular way, or they're using gas heating and they're in a slightly colder environment. You won't know. You need to have a kind of independent arbiter. That's one area I think there is enormous scope for helping, is informed consumers. Just as businesses are struggling to understand their true costs of carbon, which is measuring complex stuff, I think as consumers, we could be helped. I think, universities have got a huge role here in mind, but we could help people to make those informed decisions. If you're going to buy bean type A or bean type B, frozen or fresh. I mean, fresh seems like it's better, right? It's organic, it's in a veg box. But it could be that frozen reduces profoundly the level of food waste, and then the total carbon impact of the production per tonne is far better to be buying frozen veg. And most of us would think that's not quite right. But we need guidance there. And I think that's doable. That's very doable to have a kind of green rating scheme. Greens are on the carbon rating scheme. I don't know if that answers your question, Gareth. Tony's got his hand up now.
Yeah, thank you very much. The question I'd like to just follow on is really to do with incentives. You mentioned incentives in the context of H&M, I think it was, and their bond. But what about incentives across the wider systems? And in particular, what about the really big companies? And I'm thinking here of oil and gas and so on. They have enormous lobbying power to protect the status quo. Yeah. What can be done to address that, and even better to reverse it, so they have a genuine incentive to lead, given their enormous financial resources?
Well, interestingly, until recently, so there's 2 points here, because it's a really good question. So I think that the incentive thing is a big place. So is it Arla? Yeah, Arla, the big dairy firm. Now, dairies are, like one of these that we do a cup of tea and they're fine. But of course, the dairy supply chain, farming, we haven't talked about farming, it's a big business. There is a huge carbon footprint question. They have changed their incentives a bit like Walmart to pay their suppliers more for, again, committing to certain targets and changing the way they do farming to lower the carbon footprint of their milk. So it's a good example where you can use financial incentives to drive the behaviours you want if you align the two there. In fact, interesting, I talked to someone from Mara a few months ago, and she was saying that they feel like the new cigarette company. There's some people looking at them as if they're slightly evil corporates now, the evil farmer, but they used not to be rich at all. They're struggling with that. Oil and gas, yes, because oil and gas companies are very different. There are some that are, you do look at them and you think they're almost sociopathic. Some of them are completely aligned with individual countries where their role is, let's be honest, geopolitical, not as much as rational economic actor. I mean, lest we forget, Aramco is the single largest actor in this space. Russia, Kazakhstan, other places still kind of problematic. Until very recently, of course, the cost of carbon was being manifest for oil and gas if they wanted to borrow money, they were having to pay more for it because people could see that their industry model was coming to an end. So, I reckon it was about $80 to $100 more. The cost of their capital was manifesting a cost of carbon of about $80 to $100 a tonne. So they were paying a premium to invest in their renewals. And interestingly, one of the problems for oil and gas, a lot of them weren't renewing their assets. So they were getting quite a lot of old assets stuck out in the North Sea and other places, which become leaky of methane and become problematic as well. So it's not a free lunch just to punish the oil and gas companies. The incentive made to drive them to behave in a slightly different way. Of course, at the moment, the cost of fuel has given them as the Shell chief exec said, a kind of cash machine, and has changed their economics profoundly. But yeah, I'm hoping the government's incentives, especially the windfall taxes that people are inducing, will force them to make the right kind of investments for short-term politics versus medium and long-term carbon commitments. Well, we're on election day in America, right? And there are candidates who are still denying climate change and it's standing. So we never say. I don't think it was a rambling answer, Tony. I'm sorry, but yeah, I completely agree with incentives matter, and I'm thinking how those work in oil and gas. It's not always as clear cut as it might first look. but there is an implied cost of carbon for oil and gas investment now, which should, in the medium term anyway, push them towards a more renewable or more controlled carbon capture, for instance.
Thank you.
Any more questions online that you can see?
No, I think that's it.
That's it. Any more questions in the room?
What's the University of Bath doing? I see a lot of cars up there.
Oh, yeah. And not enough electric charging. I think that's a really good question. And the university, so we do obviously have significant commitments to carbon reduction, the scope 1, scope 2 level. And so we designed our new building to be ambient. So there's a whole host of things that are going on there. There's also perhaps our most impressive work led by colleagues like Steve Kaiser, who's made a heroic effort for the best part of 15 years when it wasn't, the fashion, as it were, to embed that all of our teaching. I think that's partly driven by what the students are demanding, but not always, because many of our students come from places where climate change is not the dominant conversation they may be having all the time. So I think it's embedded in them. One hopes that produces a kind of community who are better informed to make the decisions in business we're talking about. We also have research activity that I think is leading the Centre for Sustainable Chemical Technologies to become the Institute of Sustainability literally this last week. And that's an extraordinary collection of applied scholars doing really important stuff in difficult places like chemicals, which most people shy away from that and go app space, but they're working in difficult spaces there. Where we are struggling, mea culpa, is our scope 3 emissions, in particular when one has a student body flies frequently around the world to get to us, and not just once, multiple times in a year. And I think it's a really profound challenge. Again, it's back to where I started. Where do you draw your boundary? At what point do you become accountable? And at what point does just drawing the boundary at that way makes you despair and doesn't give you any sense of empowerment and agency? It just makes you think, oh, there's nothing I can do. So there's almost a psychological element to it. You want to push the boundary so you have more impact. When you open the boundary so wide that it feels like whatever I do is meaningless, then you've just disempowered yourself. And then, that way leads, what does it matter? I'll put the gas fire on. I'll invest in clean. So I've pivoted away, you'll notice, from the university specifically. But yeah, I think we're doing good things in scope 1 and 2. I think we're doing good things in education and research. I think our scope 3 challenge is still one to be resolved. But that's not just us. As every UK university effectively is funded by Chinese students, and so they have a large proportion.
All right, lady behind.
I was just thinking about the difficulty that people have in being responsible or feeling responsible for their own mess, And a memory came to mind. In the 70s, we lived in a very small village in Germany where they just got the running water. They'd been forced into it, but they hadn't got sewage disposal. So people hadn't got a service that everyone else thought was a very good idea. They didn't really want it because they had a system.
Closed loop system.
There was a system. The sewage that landed on the field probably wasn't a very good idea at all, actually. Landed on the fields, and people felt in control of a great amount of waste disposal, actually. And I was interested in you saying that it's hard to tell what's good and bad, because obviously the best intentions were there. Actually, the wells were already polluted when they were forced into the running water. But this good idea, public service, actually making people less powerful in the sense of inhabiting their environment and dealing with.
Well, I mean, we connect that to the idea of the car and its take over our society, both pitched and viscerally about sense of independence, control over your own movement.
And the reality is, we're stuck in traffic most of the time. It's really not our control. We're just sitting in a box doing that process. But if you're used to driving and getting public transport, you know how different it is. Something that sense of, especially in the UK public transport, and driving at the moment is a slightly random process when you arrive. It is, if you go to Japan and you go train, you know it's going to. But there's something there about that sense of a solution that is feeling empowering. But we have to be careful. So why I think this is part of the solution, because sometimes it is the mass scale, it is the volume work that just allows us to access lower cost, could allow us to access a lower carbon per unit. There are lots of local solutions that look and feel, and they might be. But might also be leaking the methane. So whereas mining is a really good example. There's some mining you could do locally, and every mine would feel like it's smaller scale. But the net effect would probably be dirtier, more emissions, less productive processes, no opportunity for carbon capture. Whereas a large scale mine, you could invest all your focal technology in one area and control it. So it's about understanding you've made a boundary choice, then making optimal assessment of where you are, recognizing what you need to hold local and what you need to let go. Recycling is full of these challenges. So most of us think recycling is good. Composting stuff. You've probably seen the stuff in the media the last week or so. So some biodegradable plastics, if you compost them in the wrong way, if you don't allow oxygen to them, basically straight to methane and are worse than non-biodegradable plastics. One of the beautiful things about plastic in its classic form, burying under the ground is inert. It doesn't go anywhere. It's carbon sink. We don't want it in the ground. It feels wrong, but it is a kind of carbon sink. It's a form of carbon capture. Whereas if you get biodegradable plastic and it biodegrades in the wrong way and produces methane, then your best intention of designing a product that wasn't as good at holding the drink or something anyway is now also causing more of a problem, but your intent was good. So I think I'm 100% with you. There are also traditional ways of working, traditional ways of behaving that we can very effectively revivify, but most people won't find them, getting on the bus being a good example.
I think it's an online question.
You want to come to your hands? No. I think it would come to the fore. I spent enough time in the last 2 years with Zoom to know what that's time. Oh,
yes. And thank you. That's a very good question and answer to finish with. I feel you've given us some great coverage of how complex it all is and how careful we need to be in our But you've also shown us that we can make a difference. We can put our money anywhere. We can choose which corporations, and we can push towards, as you said, a green calorie count.
I think that would be a very helpful thing.
So I'd like to ask you to again thank Mike for his talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Sorry,
And just to say, next month we'll be dealing with how local business can help with climate change. Thank you all very much for coming, and online too.